Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Psychology Video Games podcast. My name is Jamie Madigan. I've made it my mission to popularize the use of psychology to creating better video games and better understanding their players. As such, each episode of this podcast explores a topic at the intersection of psychology and video games, and I interview an expert on that topic. This is the episode about biofeedback and psychophysiology. Keep in mind that you can always go to psychologyofgames.com to find all the back episodes of this podcast, plus literally hundreds of articles that I've written about the psychology of video games. You know, there's actually a lot going on when you play a video game. There's the obvious stuff like jamming on buttons, throwing controllers, and shouting about how whatever just killed you needs to be nerfed. But there's also a lot going on under the skin and between your ears, in the fleshy bits of you that hopefully never see the light of day. There's a whole field of psychology called psychophysiology, psychophysiology that's concerned with the physical and psychological aspects of psychological processes. That is, it's interested in what your various organs, including your brain, are doing when your mind does what it does and how those things interrelate. Biofeedback may be a term that you're more familiar with, and it lives in the same neighborhood as psychophysiology. And, of course, those studying this kind of stuff have turned their fancy equipment in the direction of video games within the last few years, in order to better understand what's happening to people when they play games. Traditionally, they set up labs and they invite gamers in to measure things like heart rate. Does this part of the game excite you and get your blood flowing? They also measure breathing. Are you trying hard, or are you relaxed at this point in the game? Are you scared? They also may measure galvanic skin response. That is, how much electricity is your skin conducting? This is a measure of emotional stress. We've all had sweaty palms while playing games, right? They also may measure eye movement. What exactly are you paying attention to in this game? Additionally, pupil dilation can also be an indicator of mental effort. Some researchers even use sophisticated equipment to measure brain activity. They can, in a way, peer inside your brain and tell what you're thinking about.
Triple then gum will make you smile. Triple then gum.
So, this is all great, right? Data are good. Yay! Well, come to think of it, just exactly what do you do with all the data? More than you might think, actually, and even more than that in the not-too-distant future. Right now, many of us carry little computers around in our pockets that are not only capable of making phone calls, but can also collect and report on all kinds of physiological data and integrate it into games. Many people also wear smartwatches or health trackers that collect and use this kind of data too. Gamified health apps are already doing this by counting our steps, our heart rates, our other activity. Serious games for rehabilitation also motivate people to complete physical and occupational therapy by incorporating their physiological reactions to games. So that's happening. But the casual games we play just for fun can also get in on the physiological action. What if you could measure people's physiological responses to a game and dynamically adjust the difficulty on the fly so that it's always just right? What if you designed a horror game that could adapt to physiological indicators of fear in the player and ratchet up the tension to near unbearable levels before a big scare that's timed just right? What if an NPC in a game refused to trust your character if you, the player, aren't relaxed enough? Or what if you could use physiological reactions or behavior to act as inputs into a game the same way that you use a mouse and keyboard or a controller? What if you could control what's going on in the game or how it's presented to you by controlling your breathing? What if you could aim a reticle just by looking at something on the screen? Well,
the main challenge of it is to make it feasible, right? So to make something that is actually engaging. It's really now a game design challenge where we have to see what can we do with this emotional data as another input channel that is going into our games, and how can we make it meaningful, because again, what game design tells us is that we need to make interactions meaningful, because otherwise we don't care about the game.
These are just a few of the topics that I'm going to discuss with this episode's expert on the psychology of video games, starting in just a minute. Hey, before we move on, just a quick reminder that this podcast and the Psychology of Games website are supported by a Patreon campaign. You can go to patreon.com/POG, that's for Psychology of Games, and there you can find out how to donate $1 or $2 a month to keep the website and the podcast going. I do rely on the support from the Patreon, so I really appreciate it. So if you could go there and check it out and at least consider, it's there if you'd like to support. Thanks. All right, everybody, thanks for joining us on the interview portion of the podcast. Once again, this episode, I have Leonard Naka from the University of Waterloo, who is here to talk us about how you feel and what your body is doing when you play games. Leonard, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, Jamie. I'm really happy to be here.
So who are you and what are you doing here?
So yeah, like you said, my name is Leonard. I'm an associate professor at the University of Waterloo and the director of the HCI, that's Human Computer Interaction Games Group. And I'm affiliated with the Games Institute at the University of Waterloo as well. We
were talking about sort of, I guess, biofeedback or biometrics is one term that's tossed around. Psychophysiology is the other term. And it is mostly about sort of like what your body is doing or like biological reactions and biological activity when you play games or consume other types of media. Generally speaking, like what is that? Because you've done a lot of research on it and you've published some book chapters and some articles giving like introductions to it. So how would you describe what you do there?
Yeah, so it's actually quite interesting because we're talking about two different sides of the same coin when we talk about biofeedback and psychophysiology. Because in psychophysiological research, we are essentially using the signals of our body, we call those physiological signals, and we use them to study what you do, psychological phenomena, right? So we're looking at what's going on in the brain by looking at the responses that we get from our body. So essentially, you're looking at processes that are sometimes tied to a direct relationship from the body and the mind. But sometimes you have a body response and it can have lots of different relationships. So you don't have that direct mapping between the response that you get and the relationship that's going on in your brain.
So give me like for example, like what kind of physiological reaction are you talking about?
Yeah, so I think a really good example is if you look at things like heart rate or galvanic skin response, which is essentially a measure of sweat production in the body. And so we can measure a high activity on that particular physiological response, but it doesn't necessarily need to map directly to, for example, arousal. Now, galvanic skin response and arousal, that's like the best direct relationship that we can have. But if we have a certain heart rate measure, that might not necessarily mean, okay, we've been aroused by a stimulus on the screen, but it just means we have a high heart rate. So it could also mean that we've just worked out just before we sat down in front of the computer. So really what we need to do is when we look at these measures, we need to control the environment within which we're taking these measures, because if we're just taking the measure, we don't know the context, so we don't know really what influences the production of the measure. So is it really the game stimulus, or is it something that's unrelated and just contextually influencing that body response?
So looking at things like heartbeat and other signals of arousal, and by the way, when psychologists and other researchers use the term arousal, they mean it generally to mean like how sort of worked up or agitated or excited you are, not necessarily how sexually turned on you are, correct?
Yeah, I get that a lot.
Yeah.
I talk about this.
I always feel like I need to throw that aside in.
That's important, yeah.
So it's things like galvanic skin response and heart rate and maybe breathing and I think like eye tracking and pupil dilation. Does this also include things like monitoring people's brain activities?
Absolutely. So that's a really fun part, but it's also like one of the hardest parts that we have in psychophysiological assessment, because when we're looking at the measures that we have available, a lot of the measures are non-intrusive, which means we're not actually sticking a needle inside your brain and, we're getting that electrical impulse that's directly, in that brain part. But essentially what we're doing is we're putting a sensor on top of your scalp, which is the skin on top of your head. And and then we're getting an electrical signal from that skin. So when I say electrical signal, keep in mind that we're not actually sending an active signal to the body, so we're not frying people's heads. But I know, it's so
disappointing. I'm considerably less worked up. I'm considerably less aroused by this whole conversation. But go ahead.
But it's essentially passive electricity. So it's a passive sensing of the electricity that's already there. Every one of us has that on our bodies, and we're just sensing the activity of the brain. And the problem is that we're really trying to map what is a three-dimensional structure of the brain onto what's the surface, essentially, which is the skull and the scalp in that case, so the skin on top of the head. Mm-hmm. So that makes it a little bit difficult to make proper inferences or proper conclusions about what's going on in the brain by just getting what is essentially just a micro voltage at a certain location on top of your head.
So like neurologists and other people studying the brains know that like different physical parts of the brains are responsible for different types of processes. So we have ones that may deal with vision, others that deal with spatial orientation, others that deal with processing emotions and so forth. And so I guess the idea is that by measuring what's happening in those areas of the brain, you can get another read on how people are reacting to what they're seeing on the screen and what they're doing.
Yeah, ideally, yes. And essentially what you're doing is you're trying to map the different lobes of the brain towards the outside structures so that when you place the electrodes, essentially you place them in an area that's corresponding to the lobe of the brain, and then you can get an activity for that specific area. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is just looking at differences between the different hemispheres, a very common method. It's called hemispheric frontal alpha asymmetry. We're looking at specific waves. Yeah, exactly. So we're looking at alpha waves, and essentially these they almost sound like military code names, right? Like alpha, beta, gamma, but they're essentially just frequencies, right? They're frequency ranges that we're looking at. So they're just number ranges, is essentially what it is. And so you're just looking at an activity within that number range that is indicative of different types of stimulation that's going on in your brain at that point.
And that involves like hooking up those sensors to people, and like, do you have to like put special equipment on them, or do you have to like shave people's heads to do that sort of stuff?
No. So obviously we're in North America, so there are ethics boards attached to all of these studies.
Yeah.
And we make sure that before we do any experimentation, that it's all ethical conduct. And essentially what it is you're wearing a cap usually, or some sort of grid device where the different sensors are mapped on the areas of your scalp, and then you're just measuring. You're making. So this is actually very important that you're whenever you're putting the electrodes on, that you're putting them on in the right order. They have like little labels on them because they're all essentially channels that are then recorded by your amplifier. Mm-hmm. And so it's just important that they're in the right locations. And so we have something called the 1020 system, for example, which tells us in which location the brain electrode is supposed to sit. And so once we've hooked that up, essentially the traditional measures, you might have done that if you are studying at a university, that you had lots of gel in your hair and you get all gelled up with those caps. And then essentially, you have a good conductance of the skin and the electrode. But we actually don't need that anymore. So it's actually quite exciting to see the modern EEG systems that we can use, where essentially all you use is water. And we even have some dry EEG systems where you don't even need that anymore. And it's really quite fascinating what has been done in sensor technology in the last 20 years in terms of the accuracy with which we're able to measure with some of these novel sensors. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, I imagine a lot of people are probably picturing like that scene from Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, where they've got the guy strapped into the chair and his eyes pried open and all kinds of wires going into them. So not so much like that.
Funny that you mentioned that, because that's a picture I see a lot when people blog about this stuff. They're like, oh my God, no, it's so
like
dangerous.
The first page of Google image search for that, whatever term they entered probably. So it sounds like you got a range of things that are pretty inexpensive and unobtrusive to do. Like you can measure somebody's respiration or their heart rate or their temperature or their eye movements, I imagine, real easily in most labs. But then you have sort of these more complicated and possibly intrusive measures of brain activity. Is there, amongst people who are studying this, is there does that affect what types of things get studied more or less?
I think it does, especially when I started with this research, which is now 10 years ago. Oh my God. Back then it was very expensive to do a lot of these studies, and you were just confined to some sort of psychological laboratory where the equipment would be available, and then you'd have to be trained in how to use it and how to do the signal analysis and all of that. And it's quite interesting how that has shifted in the last years. Some of these sensors are now just a couple of $100s, and some of them are consumer grade devices that you can get. And the interesting thing is also that we've seen a shift, especially when it comes to emotion assessment, that used to be done with what we call facial electromyography. So that stands for measuring the muscular activity of your face. And if you've ever seen a show like Lie to Me, you're kind of familiar what that means, probably, because the guy always looks at people's faces and just says, okay, now I know what emotion you have.
Right. Those little micro expressions
exactly.
Sometimes hardly even perceivable, except if you have special equipment.
Exactly. And it's as you obviously know, it's all based on Paul Ekman's research on the facial action coding system, which is a system that gives us a lot of these expressions, a lot of the emotions that are tied to different facial expressions. And it's quite interesting that a lot of the recent emotion research studies have actually taken that and turned that into algorithms, because the camera technology has gotten so much better. And now you can, and this is fascinating because now you can get cameras that are that are high resolution and allow us to really see some of these things that before we could only sense through the sensors. And even there's a new one, the Intel sensing technology, and I think Razer has a thing called the Stargazer, which is a video camera that has depth sensing inside the camera. So yeah, what you get is it's essentially a high resolution webcam. All of a sudden you have this ability to 3D scan the face. And I think some of the listeners might know this from Snapchat, and where you're able to get these rainbows coming out of your mouth and that silly stuff. But anyways, what's actually behind some of these fun things is a lot of really complicated algorithms on how to detect your face and how to detect different facial emotions. And it's quite fascinating because they can actually turn your facial expressions into emotional indices, if you want. So measures of what kind of emotional stage you're in real time. So just imagine that you can now feed this into a game in real time, because all you need is a webcam in front of you while you're playing the game, and the game could react to your emotions.
Or map those emotions onto your avatar for other players to see, for example?
Yeah, even that.
So you could have breakthroughs in nonverbal communications and the way that people interact with each other's avatars. Yeah, and I think I've seen tech demos along those lines where have this lizard person showing genuine emotion that maps directly onto what the player looking into the webcam is doing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you've probably also seen that unspeakable Peter Molyneux demo of I don't know, it was I think now 10 years back or something, where we had emotional expressions of the avatar, and he really wanted real emotions in the game. And I think that's still something that's really, really hard to achieve for game developers, to find real emotional reactions, because just because we can sense emotion doesn't necessarily mean that we can build games that make sense of that emotion and react appropriately, right? So that's the big challenge right now.
So yeah, that kind of leads into the next question then. Why study this stuff? I mean, you're a researcher primarily, and you, I think, have experience in game design. What do you hope to get out of researching and understanding this psychophysiology and biofeedback?
Well, I hope to really be able to understand the complex emotions that games give us, because one of the things that I first noticed in a lot of the studies, the early studies that I ran, is that the standard dichotomy, which is essentially a separation between positive and negative valence, and valence just stands for that you have a positive or negative emotion, let's say, right? You're feeling very positively or very negatively about something. And so that holds very nicely if you're looking at static stimuli. So if you have something like a picture, if you have a sound and things that are very isolated, that works quite nicely. And a lot of the early psychophysiological research used those stimuli for building that understanding of how these responses work. But then when we started using it in games, all of a sudden we had these very, very complex stimuli. And it's just really hard now to tease out what parts of the game and what mechanic exactly, or like what action on the game will actually evoke a certain emotional response. And this is something that I've been chasing for a while now, just trying to understand what parts in the game give you what emotions, and usually they're complex. It's not just, okay, this is just positive or this is just negative, but a lot of the games, and if you've ever played Dark Souls, you know this, give you this emotional complexity where you're frustrated, but you're also happy at the same time, and this whole feeling of building this competence of overcoming your challenges and getting better at things is something that's still really hard to map in the psychophysiological space. So I'm trying to understand if that's possible, that we can map some of that.
Yeah, it seems like it's a problem that is present in a lot of different areas of games research. Researchers in, say, violence and aggression in video games run into this as well, where they're looking at something and saying, oh, well, people are having these reactions to the game, but it's difficult to create a research program that teases out, like, well, was it because of the violent imagery? Was it because of frustration? Was it because of interpersonal interactions? Was it because of some other types of things where many, many things are happening at any given instant in a game, and it's tough to tease those out and in a way that where you're working with something that actually looks like is recognizable as a video game, as opposed to like something just so pared down that it's so simplistic and of limited or very specific value. So have other what are game developers doing with this type of stuff? Are there people out there in user test labs and game designers who are employing biofeedback and this sort of thing?
So this is actually something that we haven't really, and that's biofeedback, right? So biofeedback, or as we call it in the literature, the biocybernetic loop, is this idea that your data, your biological, physiological data, is being processed in real time, and then responses are being created by the computer. But however, by displaying your responses, let's say if we go back to that example of the character that all of a sudden starts to smile, we have a feedback loop, because now you can see your emotional responses displayed in the game world. And now that display then in turn affects how you feel as a result of seeing it, right? So you have a direct feedback loop between inputting your emotions, but also reflecting on your emotions as you see them. And this is a very interesting area of study, because now we can investigate what types of emotions drive certain gameplay behaviors. And we can also individually customize gameplay experiences. And I think that's sort of the thing that a lot of developers are interested in, just to customize these aspects. Not a lot of developers have used physiological sensors. One comes to mind, which was a Kickstarter campaign for the game Nevermind, that came, I believe that came out of a games competition. And so Nevermind was a game that is using different types of physiological sensors to influence how you're feeling inside of the game world. The interesting thing is that there's different ways of doing that, right? So there's direct ways in which you want to change the input in the world. And I actually wrote a paper at Kai 2011 about this, where I had two different types of control now in the physiological world. One is direct control and one is indirect control, where in the direct control paradigm, and that's sort of the idea of directly controlling things in the game world, we would not have the same responses from all of the same sensors. So some sensors are much better for this direct control than others. So for example, we had a heart rate sensor and we had a breathing sensor. The breathing sensor...
I think I see where you're going with this, yeah.
Yeah, so that's a direct one, because every time you breathe in, that's an active thing that you do from your body. You have control over that. However, the heart rate is just passively influenced. So you have to breathe in a bunch of times, and then all of a sudden your heart rate starts going up as a result of this. So heart rate then can be used for things like the weather, the music, sort of the dynamic ambience of the game world. And it's been, in our study anyways, it has been much more effective to trigger those aspects. And the direct sensors are much better for things like flamethrower length. So we had a guy running around with a flamethrower, and whenever you breathe in, you'd have a longer flame that you could throw then. And that was kind of something people really enjoyed. We also had a muscle sensor on the leg, so whenever they would flex their leg muscles, they would jump higher, and that's again something that's very direct because they're flexing the muscle, and they felt like that really worked for them because they could directly control the strength of the jump just by strengthening their own muscle. So that's sort of the area I think where there's a lot of potential for games in the future to tap into some of these sensors.
Just kind of a side thought, but that seems like that would be great for somebody trying to do physical therapy, for example, like to recover from an injury or surgery by flexing certain muscles in order to make something happen in a game. A great way to motivate them to participate in the physical therapy or cognitive therapy even.
Yeah, funny that you mentioned that because stroke rehabilitation is actually a big topic for serious game developers. So there are a lot of papers out there that are dealing with stroke rehabilitation and trying to get people to do precise movements and just helping them to exercise in a way that they get control of their body again. And I think that works quite nicely with games because games are sort of this motivating environment and they guide you in the movement. So it's nice.
What are some other applications or ways that you see this sort of research and these sorts of technologies impacting games that people would actually play in their homes or on their phones or whatever, sort of consumer grade things?
So there's two things that I'm very excited about right now, and one is actually one of the grants I'm working with right now, where we're trying to develop a sort of a personal health tracking application, and we're trying to feed that health tracking data back into a game-like environment. And I think that's a big growing market right now. A lot of people are very happy to track their personal health. Obviously, we've seen the Apple Watch and other devices that now allow us to have a direct overview of, our step count and how active we've been throughout the day. And so people really like having that data available. And then, of course, if you're tracking all that data, it would make sense to feed that data into, for example, your mobile games and other things, right? Because we are engaging a lot more nowadays with mobile devices and mobile technology than we are with computers. So having games on mobile devices that use some of this health and wellness data is going to allow us to understand better how we can improve ourselves. So I think there's a potential in feeding some of that body data back into games that improve our motivation to become healthier. But then the other big thing is, of course, VR, right? Like we've seen a lot of amazing virtual reality demos. A lot of really cool headsets are coming out and are being finalized too. It's not just the Oculus anymore. And I think what's happening now is that people can be so immersed with these virtual realities that they're quite excited to customize that experience even more, because really what it means, virtual reality, it gives us a custom camera. Like we used to have a very fixed camera, not really with height in any case as a factor. And now we have that when we move around with a virtual reality headset. And the interesting thing is, what if you're, in a horror game and you're also feeding your heart rate back to that game world, and you can actually be physically active because you're not sitting in front of the computer. You're wearing the headset, and then you have those movement trackers in your hands. And I think that's where it gets really interesting, that you can now really feed that data back in an immersive way, that you're really entrenched in this game world, and it helps you customize how you're feeling about the gameplay experiences that you're having. And this is important, right? Like a lot of people say games are not personalized anymore. Obviously, nowadays we have so many games that you just pick and choose the game that fits you as a person. But really, for a developer to be successful, you want your game to appeal to a very broad audience. And so from that side, it actually does make sense to have something that is customizable in the way that Pokemons were customizable a while ago for a lot of individual users.
Yeah, that's interesting. And the stuff you're talking about with the VR and like the horror games makes me think that if you had some measure of like a person's arousal or like their heart rate or their breathing, then you might be able to dynamically control that game and sort of get these nice like peaks of like terror and fright, and then you bring it down to a valley of sort of like normalcy, and then you build up to a bigger fright. And that sort of structure is very effective. It's why roller coasters have lots of ups and downs, right? And it's why horror movies have typically like the structure that they do. Like it's not just a giant massacre 5 minutes into the movie and then 65 minutes of like nothing happening. It's event after event after event. So if you could get to a place where you could, on a per player basis, sort of control those peaks and valleys, I imagine that would be a great experience if that's what you're into, if that's the type of horror genre that you're into. Do you think like anything like that is either in the works or is possible?
I think the main challenge of it is to make it feasible, right? So to make something that is actually engaging, just because we have that data, it might not be pleasing for everyone, right? So it's really now a game design challenge where we have to see what can we do with this emotional data as another input channel that is going into our games, and how can we make it meaningful? Because again, what game design tells us is that we need to make interactions meaningful, because otherwise we don't care about the game. So if you want to develop a really good game with that physiological data, you want to make the interaction meaningful with that data. And for that, I think we're still looking for a killer app, right? Like something that really incorporates that in a way where we all think, oh yeah, that makes sense. I never thought of that. But if I had that in the back of my head, I wouldn't be a professor. I wouldn't be making lots of money with this.
There you go. Sort of while we're on the topic, let me tell you my other dream, my other big idea, my idea that if I could do it, I would be right there with you, on the beach. And I've written about this on the website before, but rhythm games like Guitar Hero or Rock Band, they're sort of out of favor now, but very popular a while back. And a lot of the appeal of those rhythm games is getting in sort of the flow channel, where like the experience is optimum because it's just difficult enough to be challenging, but not overwhelming and not too easy to be boring. And you sort of get in the zone and you experience psychological flow, and it's a lot of fun. You enjoy it. And there's also research, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but research showing that like as we focus on something and as a task becomes more difficult, our eyes will dilate. And if a game could sort of notice that and pick up on it and sort of change the rate at which the notes on a rhythm game are coming at you, or the complexity, or the dynamically adjust the difficulty to sort of like get you into that state of nirvana, that state of psychological flow, and keep you there for longer by adjusting the difficulty of the game to match whatever your skills and your interests happens to be.
Yeah, I think flow is a very difficult beast to study with these measures. I've ran several studies where I've been trying to understand how flow influences the physiological responses. But the problem that we have is that flow itself is just so ill-defined in terms of what it means and what it means for the individual person.
From measurement standpoint, yeah.
Yeah, like I think like if we're talking, scientific jargon here, the thing that we're looking for is cognitive involvement. Like we're really looking for something that keeps your attention very focused. And for that, yeah, eye tracking and, pupil dilation measures, those would be great because they can actually keep you involved in a cognitively interesting fashion over time. They would sense, okay, he's losing interest, so what are we doing now? We gotta come up with something, right? So that's, I think, definitely a good way to tie people to games. But is it really flow? Because flow, I think, is more than just providing that skill challenge balance. It's also, that the time passes quickly and you're just kind of losing track of everything. And so you can't assess a lot of the dimensions that define flow. So it's really difficult, but I think it's a first step for sure. And obviously, whenever you talk about games, flow comes up. People always think it's, the holy grail of getting people into flow. But I must say, for me, sometimes I just enjoy the in and out of the game, right? Like I really like games like Minecraft, where I can go in, build a couple of things, and I can be done and go out and be my merry ways. Mm-hmm. So I think, yeah, it's there is potential, but I think another potential is really looking at the games that we play online, and a lot of them are sort of popular, I think, with a larger and growing crowd, but we don't really think of them as core game players, because we really think of traditional video games. We think of consoles and all that stuff. But a lot of these games are.
Give me an example. What kind of game are you talking about?
I was thinking of things like I think it started with Farmville and some of these Zynga games, and now it's Clash of Clans and some of these other games. Although some of these are much more social these days, but oftentimes these games involve you putting down a task and then letting that task run for a couple of minutes or hours, and then return to that task. So essentially, the engagement is kept by you starting something and then doing something else and coming back to that task, and then that something is done. So essentially what happens is there's some number crunching going on in the background, some timer going off, and then overall you've achieved something in the game world. And it'd be kind of interesting to see what those games could do with your data over the day. So let's say, you start, track now, gather resources from the mine, and you can only gather resources from the mine if you make it past a step count of X during that day. So all of a sudden, your physiological activity during that day becomes a factor in the game world, and it just measures it over time. You don't have to do it right then and there. And I think that's quite interesting, looking at resources in the game world and how those resources tie to actually real life resources, like cognitive resources, physical resources, health resources that we have available to ourselves as we go by our daily lives anyways.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, essentially you're talking about gamifying health activities and so forth, but more so than is typically done. I mean, you're literally talking about, hey, you can't harvest your strawberries in Farmville until you've burned like 1,300 calories or whatever.
Yeah, I would actually say it's better not to gamify it, but to have the game and your life kind of be tied together. I guess a lot of people call that gamification, but to me, that's really more your real life all of a sudden integrates into the customization of your game. And that's kind of where it's interesting. So it's not necessary. So it's not like the game is driving your behavior, but your behavior is driving whatever happens in the game. So you have that element of surprise as you're going back to the game that, all of a sudden X or Y become available because I've done something. And you don't necessarily know all of the things that are available to you as you go through your daily lives.
But there's a cycle there, because things that happen in the game will motivate you to pay attention to what you're doing in life and motivate you to change your behaviors potentially. Or it could certainly be used that way. What are some other things that can be gotten out of this?
I think some other things that could be quite interesting is when we look at massively online battle arena games, so at esports and in that area, a lot of the times, these are massive events, and if you look at how we're tracking the performance of sports players in soccer or in baseball and other big events, a lot of them are fully data mined, if you want, right? Like a lot of them, we're tracking their pulse at every minute, we're tracking their location on the playing field and all of that stuff. Now, we don't have, or actually we do have other measures, but not quite exactly the same measures available for professional esports players. And I think one of the things that would be interesting is to look at those performance profiles, and we already have the in-game performance data, so we know where they went and where they clicked and what they did, and we could study that to understand their reasoning and their strategies. But now, if we add the physiological data on top of that, we also see the moments of high stress, and it really gives an insight into what strategies in multiplayer games inform how people, how the human behavior is guided by whatever the stimulus in the game produces at that point. So it helps us kind of study athlete performance, if you look at esports folks as athletes, and really understand how they struggle and how they overcome their struggles within a match and within that competitive environment.
So here's what you need to do. You just need to get a medical supply company to sponsor the Dota 2 championships, and then hook them up to some EEGs that were donated, and there's all your data. You've got research for years off of that.
That would be fantastic. These
are free ideas. I'm just throwing them out there.
Yeah. Let's hope somebody from a medical supply company is actually listening to this podcast.
You never know. You never know. That would be interesting. And I would see implications there for coaching as well, and for shaping behaviors and informing strategies. And then I also sort of already see like the divide happening between the purists who say like, no, it's taking away from, the soul of the game. And there are people saying like, well, no, here's how we enhance performance. And then there will be the eventual debate about whether or not, this is considered performance enhancing, intervention along the lines of steroids or that sort of thing. Professional esports have already started down those lines with, people dosing with like Adderall and caffeine and that sort of stuff, but a whole separate discussion. It seems like we're pretty close to being to this point where, physiological reactions and activities are inputs to the game in the same way that pushing buttons on a controller is, or maybe indirect inputs like you were describing earlier. We're all carrying around phones that can measure activity. Smartwatches have heart rate and temperature and blood flow analysis built in. Do you remember like a few years ago, the Nintendo Vitality sensor that was sort of talked about but never happened?
Yeah, there were a couple of those. Ubisoft had one as well.
Did they?
I forgot the name right now, but so the Vitality actually came up a couple of times, and that was just a pulse oximeter. And there were ideas of how to use that, but essentially a lot of these things didn't make it through because the games just weren't good enough, right? Like essentially they ended up just being biofeedback games where all you did is train your response to an environment and try to relax yourself and all that stuff. Instead of using those measures in a real game just to augment little bits and pieces of the game, which would have, in my opinion, been much more popular with gamers than if you make a game just specifically for training how to, steer your body in a different direction.
Yeah. So that almost seems like a big lesson learned or something you shouldn't do. Like, what do you think that if this were to become the next big thing in games, like what would be the mistakes game developers and designers and hardware manufacturers would want to avoid? Like, what would they not want to do?
Well, I think the main thing is accessibility, right? Like I know that Valve, for example, has investigated some of the possibilities from these sensors, but then they ended up going with what seemed to be the most interesting thing for the market, which was the virtual reality headset. But they've definitely, if you look online, you'll find some of the patents. They've definitely worked on different types of sensors and controllers that can measure your stress level and other things as you're engaging with the game. So I think the thing really is that we need better sensors, and they're already being manufactured. They're really tiny. They're just looking like patches these days. So really, it's just like putting on a Band-Aid, and all of a sudden you can sense X or Y on your body. So as soon as this is the latest in terms of research. So it's not mass market yet, but
so is that like an RFID technology where it connects?
Basically, well, the RFID would just be the communication protocol to make sure that yes, when the patch is on the body, then it can communicate with some other device. So you would need to have a computer on your body, but usually you have a phone with you. And so essentially the sensor would just communicate, Bluetooth or otherwise, with your phone and send the body data to that phone, where then the phone or the computing device is doing all the other processing. So all we need to do is just make the sending of that physiological information as small and as convenient as possible. And again, like some of these prototypes I've seen a year or two ago in research labs. I know that they're being done. There's other things that I've seen that I can't talk about, but just to give you an idea, some of the research labs are working on proximity-based sensors as well. So it's not even on your body anymore, but it can still sense the physiological reaction. So that could be something that's just in your room, but it would still sense your physiological reaction, right?
I'm equal parts like excited and terrified by this concept.
Yeah, but this is kind of where we're going, right? Like this technology is on the brink of becoming really important. So if you're looking more at the next 10 to 15 years, once a lot of these devices become more mass market, there will be more impact for game developers. It's actually something that I think we see quite nicely. Let's take Valve as an example and what happened after the Oculus gained traction with the Kickstarter campaign is it really swayed public opinion about VR, and people got more excited because all of a sudden there was this one person that said, we can do this, we can make this technology acceptable to a mass market, and it really helped overcome that hype curve and go into something where people say, okay, this is actually sustainable as we go forward. And sensors are kind of still somewhere on that hype curve where people are not sure how to commercially exploit it, but I think they're going to get into that stage where all of a sudden they will be cheap, they will be very, very easy to put on, and very easy to communicate between the sensor and your smart devices, and then all of a sudden we can make that data available in lots of different contexts. And then the game developers will say, you know what, it's already available, people are buying this stuff, we got to integrate this into our games. And that's, I think, when we see the mass market rise of these technologies in games. So it's really kind of fun to be doing this research right now when, like maybe 10, 15 years down the line, all of a sudden it will have a new relevance to the games being developed, as a lot of these technologies will be as commonplace as smartphones are today.
Yeah, it seems like it's a tough sell to a mass market if you say like, okay, I need you to like shave the hair off on this part of your arm and then apply, this device, like tape this device every time you sit down to play a game, or put this gel in your hair and then, put this headband on.
Exactly.
But if it's something that's unobtrusive and, like, for example, like something built into the controller that makes contact with your skin, or something built into a VR headset that makes contact with your skin, or if it's just a device that is like integrated into the gaming console and is scanning you somehow, then when that stuff gets cheap, it'll kind of be like when gyroscopes became cheap and, Sony started including them in their controllers, their DualShock controllers, so that you could use that type of stuff. Didn't exactly catch on. Most games don't use the gyroscope, but the technology did make it into that mass market device. So what industries are driving the R&D in this area? I suspect it's not games. Where is the innovation coming from?
It's actually quite interesting because a couple of these first inventions, especially this idea with the biocybernetic loop, that's from the 80s from a NASA engineer called Alan Pope, actually a very, very nice researcher at NASA that has looked at the different types of biofeedback that are possible, and then he moved and implemented that technology within a gaming context, which is interesting because it was really more for aviation and helping pilots focus while they're controlling airplanes. And then that same technology would help hyperactive kids help focus and control as they're trying to learn how to control their bodies. So I think it's mainly in those other industries that are more about system critical operations that people are more interested in that. Of course, in the medical context, and I think. Really, the big market right now, I think, where we can see a lot of these innovations coming from is the quantified self technologies.
Now, what is that?
So that's this idea that you're just tracking everything that you do as a person, right? And so just think of any sort of activity or health tracker that you have out there. So think of Withings and Fitbit and these larger companies that are trying to innovate that. Actually, fun fact, if you look at, for example, at the Withings scale, they came up with this new body scale. It's such a good example of how unobtrusive you can be with some of these sensors, because all you do is stand on that very, very flat, very sleekly designed scale, and you get an idea about your body fat. So there's argumentation about how accurate that is, but ideas about your heart rate activity. Now they're looking at new measures now of how the blood is actually being pumped through your body and how that velocity affects your personal wellness. So really what they're looking at is at micro vibrations in your feet that give an idea of how your blood is pumping. So really it's just a matter of making the right inferences from the sensors that you have available. And a lot of the times that is just looking at that. It's looking at touch, it's looking at how much force you exert, it's looking at vibrations and other things. And then you can make an inference about, okay, there is something else going on physiologically in the body. So it might just be something like a chair at some point that you're sitting down in this chair, and just based on your movement, it can sense your physiological reactions, and it will then make sense of that in your game.
Yeah, it seems like the work that you and your other colleagues are doing is a lot of that, like, well, what are the models, like what, and how do we make those inferences, and how do we refine what we do with this information is sort of like the step that's happening between that stuff becoming mass market. Because like you said, the technology is there, but like once you have the data, you got to kind of figure out what it means and how things link together, and you got to create models, in other words, and make sense of it. So hopefully you will have that figured out by the time these things are part of our everyday gaming experience.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, anything else you wanted to bring up that I haven't asked about?
No, I think we had a nice little tour de force about all the different important areas of physiological game design, physiological interaction, psychophysiological evaluation. I'm just really happy that it's possible to do these things today, because even if I look at the last 10 years and look at how much that field has evolved, it makes me really excited about the next 10 to 15 years, because I know what is possible, and I know what can be done in such a short amount of time. And I think we're really in for a treat to kind of see these sensors and these technologies evolve as we get more savvy and much smarter with the technological devices around us.
Fantastic. So where would people go on the internet if they wanted to follow along with you and find out the research that you've been doing and find out more about you?
So I think the best first stop is our HCI Games Group website, which is hcigames.com in one word. They could also just Google my name. There's probably lots of publications and other things that would come up. But yeah, HCI Games is the website. Or you go to YouTube and you look for HCI Games, and we have a YouTube channel that we're planning to improve and have more examples and more explanations, and trying to help translate the knowledge that we're generating.
Okay. And I'll include links to those in the blog post that goes along with the podcast episode.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So, final question. Have you been playing anything? Have you had time to actually play games, or have you been too busy?
So, this is a very good question, because obviously I started this research because I was very interested in playing games. But as you become more busy and you do more things, you have to actually make yourself play games. So my favorite game still that I come back to every once in a while is Minecraft. It's just a really good relaxation game for me that I just play for like half an hour every once in a while when I need to take a break. But I've also recently started playing more online games. So I have a couple of friends that I play Destiny with on the PlayStation, and also Diablo 3 on PlayStation with a couple of friends.
Those are all great games. Yeah, they just announced a new massive expansion for Destiny. That I think we'll get more information on at E3, which is just about to happen at the time that we're recording this, and probably will have happened by the time anybody listens to it. But yeah, there's a lot more information coming out about that. I bounced off Destiny. Well, I say bounce, but I played it probably for 30, 40 hours, which is a lot, for one game, and played all the vanilla content, and but then just sort of didn't get back into it after any of the other additional stuff came out, and didn't stick with the competitive multiplayer in it either. But I really enjoyed the time that I did spend with it.
Yeah, I think it really only works when you have a group of friends that you play with. Like as a single player game, it wasn't as exciting. In that regard, I'm actually really looking forward to the new Uncharted. That's on my list of things I want to play.
Yeah, I'm about 4 or 5 hours into it. It's
nice.
It's cinematic, like most of the Uncharted games are, but really well done. I mean, just you look at it and I'm amazed that wow, this is on a PlayStation 4. This is just looks great, and it's more than just the quality of the graphics. It's the quality of the animation and the acting and the set design, and just the idea that you look at an environment and you're like, hundreds of man hours must have gone into creating this coffee table, with these magazines on it, and I'm never going to look at it again in the game. And that's just incredible that they put that much work and that much craft into that game. But yeah, I'm definitely going to finish that, and I finally picked up Overwatch, which is
I heard lots about that.
Yeah, online competitive shooter from Blizzard, and I had been in the beta, so I played a lot of it in the beta and liked it a whole lot, and picked up the final retail product a couple of nights ago, and I've been enjoying that all over again. And like I said, I found a few people from some message board communities that I'm a part of, and we've been playing just about every night. And it is a lot better when you have, voice chat and people you're familiar with and you can buddy up with. So very cool. Well, thanks so much for coming on. This was really interesting, and it's one of those things that, like you said, in 10 years, it's gonna be more part of our gaming lives than it is now, for sure. I think that it's going to take off in one way or another, whether it be in AAA console games or in mobile games or serious games. It's going to be there, and there's probably a lot more research and a lot more interesting things to find out as we go. So thank you very much for coming on, and we'll all stay tuned.
Thank you, Jamie. It was lots of fun.
All right, these readings indicate that you have reached the end of the Psychology Video Games podcast. Thanks for sticking with us. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Again, remember that you can always go to psychologyofgames.com to find all the back episodes of the podcast. You can also go there to subscribe to the podcast, and I will deliver it to whatever device you prefer automatically so that you can listen to the next episode for free. And you can go to Psychology of Games to find out how to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, RSS, newsletter, various options. Thanks, and I'll talk to you next episode.